experimental buildings. So no matter what, there would have been experimental science going on at the Nevis estate. Starting in 1934, a gentleman named Professor Hugh Finley, who was director of landscape architecture at the School of Architecture at Columbia University, was put in charge of Nevis. Hugh Finley is kind of a fascinating fellow. During World War I, he was in charge of a major gardening project among conscientious objectors and German prisoners of war to raise victory or defense gardens. For those people who, like me, are too young to know what that means, a victory garden or a defense garden is a garden where you grow food for yourself in order so that the troops overseas will have more food. They grew them in World War I. As I'm about to describe, they grew them in World War II as well. Sort of a different notion of sacrifice than we practice today. At the time, the place was occasionally known as the Hamilton Arboretum and Gardens, even though the formal arboretum that you saw on the previous slide was never constructed. And he also hosted many events on the Nevis property while he was here. You see a picture of a picnic here. He also taught classes in gardening. Gardening was, again, very important to him and apparently very important to Columbia. Among other things, Hugh Finley was the first inventor of gardening tools for the blind. He was also among the first people to analyze the structure of plants using X-rays. When you talk about Nevis, you just can't get away from those high-energy photons. I can't resist showing you this picture, even though it's going to be a little achronological, as I will explain in just a moment, because it's just a pretty picture. But also for an architectural note, you can see the ivy growing on the sides of the mansion house here. That ivy is gone. If you're interested in preserving a building, you do not want ivy to be growing on it. I also want to mention, even though this photo was taken in 1939, that in 1947, the president of Columbia University contemplated moving his residence to this mansion house. And if he had done so, there's little doubt in my mind that this would still be a perk of the office of president of the university to this day. However, that university president in 1947, a fellow named Dwight Eisenhower, decided that he preferred a home that was just a little bit whiter. In 1941, Columbia finally made the decision, no, there was not going to be an arboretum constructed at Nevis. Arboretum temporarily delayed due to financial constraints. That was not to be the last time those words would be used in connection with Nevis projects. Still to this day, it's almost as if they're quoting. During the war years, as I mentioned, Professor Hugh Finley encouraged area residents to plant victory and defense gardens on their property and on this property. It was very important to him. And during this time, the mansion house began to be used for housing married graduate students, and this lasted until 1954. However, at 1954, Columbia determined that if students were to continue living on the third floor of the mansion house, they would have to build a fire escape that reached to the third floor. And so the students were pulled out rather than building that fire escape. I'd like to think this was for architectural reasons and not because they were too cheap to build a fire escape. In 1945, as Professor Finley was retiring, Columbia University started making plans for building a cyclotron facility on this property. Columbia had already had a prior cyclotron that was built in 1938 and was in the basement of Nevis Labs, the primary physics laboratory on Columbia campus. At the time that it was built, it had been the most powerful particle accelerator in the world. Among other things, it was the first particle accelerator to crack the atom. But by the mid-1940s, particularly with the interest in scientific research post-World War II, it was very clear that this cyclotron would no longer be sufficient to continue on with the research. And Columbia needed more room. It was not available on the Columbia property, and they had this great big estate just sitting here. So the decision was made to build the Columbia cyclotron on this property, and it was started in 1947. It was funded by the Office of Naval Research and the Atomic Energy Commission. I understand that some of the money left over from the Manhattan Project was used for this. The Atomic Energy Commission eventually turned into the Department of Energy. The cost back then was $3 million, roughly $30 million in today's money. And if you're wondering where that money went, we'll get to that. So here's a photograph of the groundbreaking, well, actually not the formal first shovel in there, but you can see the beginning construction of the pit for the Nevis cyclotron. And here we have the building, the cyclotron building itself. And we still call this building the cyclotron building, even though, as we shall see, there is no cyclotron in there anymore. If we were to name it accurately by the particle accelerator that's there, we would call it the Van de Graaff building, but yeah. Now, a couple of notes, architectural notes about this building. First of all, although of course you can't see it in this black and white photograph, this building is covered in red brick. Why is it covered in red brick? Because the mansion house is covered in red brick and this building is covered in red brick. The architects decided that they wanted to make that building fit in with the architectural look and feel for the rest of the property. In fact, all of the buildings on this property are constructed of red brick on the outside, except for one. Columbia University Press, which was started up in the, I think, 1960s, had its original building was in red brick, but they put on an extension that was covered in white brick. I guess the architects didn't think it was all that important to make it fit in. If you walk up there, it looks awful. Oh, man. Another thing to notice is these round windows in the side of the building. Remember that the Nevis was funded in part by the Office of Naval Research. Those windows are decommissioned portholes from a decommissioned battleship. Now, the first director of Nevis Labs, a fellow named John Dunning, argued against there being windows in this building. He said, what is the purpose of them? And the architects responded, we want to make the building look less like a factory. And John Dunning said, the building has a 50-ton crane inside. How is it not going to look like a factory? But the architects won, and we're glad they did. It adds a nice feel to the building, and plus you can see around inside the building when there's a power outage at Nevis, which could happen at any moment. If you work here, you know this sort of thing. Here is an aerial photograph of Nevis at the time. Kind of hard to get aerial photographs now. It's a private in-joke. Columbia won't let me fly a drone.